The town of Angels Peak was a place where people came to forget. Tucked into a high, sun-baked corner of the Arizona Territory, it was a quiet, dusty collection of adobe and timber, a place where the past was a story best left untold. At the edge of this quiet town, on a small, prosperous ranch, lived a woman who had forgotten more than most. Her name was Isabella, though the town knew her as Ellie. She was a widow, a woman of quiet, striking beauty, with hair as black as a raven's wing and eyes the color of a stormy sky. She ran her late husband's ranch with a confidence and a grit that had earned the grudging respect of the local cattlemen. She was a good neighbor, a quiet presence at church, a woman who seemed perfectly at home in her peaceful, domestic world. But sometimes, when she was alone, her hands, calloused from the hard work of the ranch, would move in a different way. They would trace the familiar, deadly lines of a pistol she no longer owned, her fingers remembering the cold, comforting weight of the steel, the smooth, deadly click of the hammer. In those moments, she was not Ellie, the widow. She was La Sombra, the shadow, and 10 years ago, her name had been a legend in the bloody, lawless border territories. She had been the leader of the deadliest, most sought-after team of guns for hire in the West, the Cuatro Sombras, the Four Shadows. They were not common thugs or outlaws. They were specialists, artists of violence, who worked for high-paying clients, dispensing a swift, final, and brutally efficient form of justice that the official law often couldn't, or wouldn't, deliver. There had been Elias, the scholar, a master of blades and strategy. There had been Gideon, the ghost, a silent tracker and sniper without equal. And there had been Marcus, the preacher, a man who could charm the devil himself and was a devil with a deck of cards and a hidden derringer. And then there was her, La Sombra, the leader, the fastest draw any of them had ever seen, a woman who could plan a battle with the mind of a general and fight it with the heart of a wolf. They had been more than a crew, they had been a family, forged in the crucible of 100 desperate gunfights. And then it had all ended. A final job, a betrayal, a bloody shootout that had left Marcus dead, and the rest of them scattered to the four winds, their family shattered. Isabella had taken her share of the money, had ridden north, and had buried La Sombra under a new name, a new life, and the love of a good, simple man, a rancher named John. Now, John was gone, taken by a fever a year ago, leaving her with the ranch, the memories, and a peace that was as fragile as a desert flower. The peace was shattered by the arrival of the Calder brothers. They were a plague, a trio of brutish, greedy men who had come to the territory with a small army of hired thugs and a voracious appetite for land and power. They had already squeezed out a half-dozen of the smaller ranchers in the region, and their greedy eyes had now fallen on Isabella's well-watered, prosperous land. The first warning was a visit from the youngest brother, a weaselly, rat-faced man named Zeke. He had offered her a laughably low price for her ranch, his offer a thinly veiled threat. She had refused, her calm, polite dismissal enraging the small man. The second warning was a fire, a mysterious blaze in her north pasture that had destroyed a season's worth of hay. Now, this evening, the final warning had come. As she rode the fence line, she was ambushed by 3 of the Calder's men. It was a clumsy, amateurish attack, and the old instincts, the skills of La Sombra, had flared to life. She had outmaneuvered them, her horse a blur of motion, and had escaped, a bullet grazing her arm, a searing, white-hot reminder of the world she had tried to leave behind. She sat in her quiet, lamplit parlor, the small wound on her arm cleaned and bandaged, a glass of whiskey untouched on the table beside her. She knew, with a cold, chilling certainty, that they would be back. They would not make the same mistake twice. They would come in force. They would come to kill her, to take her land, to erase her. She was alone. The townspeople were good folk, but they were terrified of the Calders. The sheriff was a weak, ineffectual man who was likely already in the Calder's pocket. She had no one to turn to. Her hand, of its own accord, went to the small, locked chest that sat by the hearth, the one that held her late husband's papers. But it held another secret as well. She opened it, her fingers tracing the worn, familiar leather of a gun belt, the polished, ivory grip of a Colt peacemaker. It was La Sombra's gun. She had not touched it in 10 years. She looked at her reflection in the dark window. She saw not the frightened widow, but the ghost of the woman she had been, her eyes cold and hard, her face set in a mask of terrible resolve. She could not fight them all. She could not win. But she was La Sombra, and she would not die without a fight. She took a deep, shuddering breath and went to her small writing desk. She took out a piece of paper, a pen, and a bottle of ink. She had no idea if her message would ever be received, if the men she was writing to were even still alive. But it was the only hope she had left. She wrote 4 letters, her hand steady, the script elegant and precise. They were addressed to 3 different, far-flung corners of the territory, to names that no one in Angel's Peak would have recognized. They were addressed to the scholar, the ghost, and, in a final, desperate prayer, to a small, forgotten mission in the south, to a grave marked with the name Marcus. The letters were short, and they contained a single, cryptic phrase, a code they had used in the old days, a call to arms that had never once gone unanswered. The shadows fall at Angel's Peak. The letters were a desperate, almost hopeless cast into the vast, indifferent ocean of the West. Isabella had no idea if her old crew was alive, or if they would even receive her message. She gave the letters to a young, trustworthy stable boy, with a handful of coins and a desperate plea to ride hard and fast to the nearest telegraph office, a day's journey away. Then she settled into wait, turning her small, peaceful ranch into a fortress, her days a tense, watchful vigil, her nights a long, sleepless war with her own rising ghosts. Miles away, in the bustling, chaotic city of San Francisco, a man known as Mr. Elias Vance was enjoying a game of chess in a quiet, exclusive gentleman's club. He was a man of quiet, scholarly distinction, with a neatly trimmed gray beard, spectacles perched on his nose, and the soft, manicured hands of a man who had never known a day of hard labor. He was a respected, and secretly feared, financial consultant, a man who moved through the city's corridors of power like a ghost. His mind a razor-sharp instrument that could build or destroy fortunes with a single, well-placed piece of information. A messenger boy, his face smudged with the grime of the city, interrupted his game, handing him a telegram. Elias excused himself, a flicker of annoyance in his calm, intelligent eyes. He opened the telegram. It contained a single, nonsensical phrase, "The shadows fall at Angel's Peak." A profound, transformative stillness settled over him. The urbane, sophisticated Mr. Vance, the man of finance and society, receded. In his place was Elias, the scholar, the master of blades and strategy. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a pale, grim mask. He stared at the words, and his mind, a cold, calculating machine, began to work. Isabella. After 10 years of silence. This was not a social call. This was a cry for help. He calmly folded the telegram and placed it in his pocket. He returned to his opponent, a portly, arrogant shipping magnate. "Forgive me, Bartholomew," he said, his voice a soft, silken whisper that held a new, chilling edge. "An old family matter has come up. I must concede the game." He did not go back to his elegant townhouse. He went to a small, nondescript warehouse on the waterfront. Inside, he opened a large, steel-banded trunk. He stripped off his fine, woolen suit and donned the practical, dark clothes of a traveler. He strapped on a custom-made harness that held a half-dozen, perfectly balanced throwing knives. And from a hidden compartment, he took out his primary tools, a matched pair of long, razor-sharp Spanish fighting daggers. He was no longer a man of numbers. He was a man of steel. Within the hour, he was on a train, heading east, a silent, deadly scholar on his way to a final, bloody examination. In the high, lonesome wilderness of the Colorado Rockies, a man lived in a small, isolated cabin, his only companions the wind and the pines. He was known to the few, scattered prospectors in the area as Gideon, a quiet, almost feral mountain man who traded furs for supplies and seemed to prefer the company of animals to men. He was a magnificent artist, his cabin walls covered in breathtakingly detailed charcoal sketches of the wildlife he observed. The telegram was delivered to him by a mail rider who made the treacherous mountain journey once a month. The rider left it in the man's drop box, a hollowed-out log at the end of the trail, knowing better than to approach the cabin of the strange, silent man directly. Gideon found the telegram that evening. He read the words, "The shadows fall at Angel's Peak," and his face, which was usually a mask of calm, stoic indifference, hardened into something ancient and predatory. The sensitive artist, the man who saw the beauty in a hawk's flight, was gone. In his place was the ghost, the man who saw the world in terms of sight lines, windage, and the cold, mathematical certainty of a long-range rifle shot. He did not pack his sketchbooks. He went to a loose stone in his hearth and pulled out a long, heavy, oilcloth-wrapped bundle. It was his prized possession, a custom-built .50 caliber Sharps buffalo rifle, a weapon of immense power and precision, capable of killing a man from over a mile away. He also packed a smaller, lighter carbine and 2 pistols. He was not just a sniper, he was a walking arsenal. He left a note for the male reader, a simple, crude drawing of a grave marker, his way of saying he would not be back. He then began the long, arduous journey down from his mountain sanctuary, a silent, deadly specter returning to a world he had long ago renounced. The final letter, the one addressed to a grave, was a shot in the dark, an act of pure, desperate faith. It was delivered to a small, struggling mission south of the border, a place of dust and quiet devotion. The old priest who ran the mission read the name on the envelope, Marcus, and his old, tired eyes filled with a profound sadness. "He is not here, my son," he said to the telegraph boy. "He has been with God these 10 years. But as the boy was about to leave, another man emerged from the cool darkness of the chapel. He was a priest, a younger man with a handsome, charismatic face, but with the eyes of a man who had seen too much of the devil's work. He was known as Father Michael. "What is it, Father?" he asked the old priest. The old man showed him the letter. Father Michael took it, and as he saw the name, and the elegant, familiar handwriting of the address, his hand trembled, just for a moment. He opened it and read the words, "The shadows fall at Angel's Peak." A war, a decade old, was instantly reignited in his soul. He was not Father Michael. He was Marcus, the preacher, and he had not died in that bloody shootout in New Orleans. He had been badly wounded, had been taken in by the priests, and in the long, painful process of his recovery, he had seen a vision, had heard a call. He had traded his derringer for a crucifix, his deck of marked cards for a rosary. He had tried to atone for his violent, sinful past by dedicating his life to God. But the call of his old family, the cry for help from the woman he had once from Isabella, it was a call he could not ignore. He looked at the crucifix on the wall, then at the letter in his hand. His soul was a battlefield. That night, he knelt in the chapel, not in prayer, but in a final, agonizing act of decision. He then went to his small, Spartan cell. He lifted a loose floorboard. Beneath it lay a small, velvet-lined case. Inside was a beautifully engraved, silver-plated Remington derringer and a deck of cards, their edges worn smooth from 1,000 illicit games. He was still a priest, but he was also still the preacher. He would ride to Angel's Peak. He would answer the call. He would face his own, personal damnation to save the woman he had left behind. The ghosts were gathering. The scholar, the ghost, and the preacher. 3 of the 4 shadows were on the move, drawn by an old, unbreakable bond, back into the world of blood and gunpowder they had tried so desperately to escape. They were coming to Angel's Peak, and they were bringing hell with them. While the ghosts of her past were riding towards her, Isabella was living through a slow, methodical, and very real hell. The day after her failed ambush, the Calder brothers began the siege of her ranch in earnest. It was not an all-out assault. That was not their way. Their way was the way of the vulture, a slow, patient circling of their prey, designed to wear her down, to break her spirit, to make her believe that a quick death would be a mercy. They started with the water. Her ranch was fed by a small, steady stream that flowed from a spring high in the surrounding hills. A half-dozen of the Calder's men rode up to the source of the stream and, with a crude but effective dam of rock and earth, diverted the flow. The stream that ran through her pastures, that filled her horse troughs and her well, slowed to a muddy, pathetic trickle. She had a full cistern for the house, enough for a week if she was careful. But her cattle, her horses, they would not last that long. Next, they began a campaign of psychological terror. They did not attack the house directly. They stayed just out of rifle range, a constant, menacing presence on the surrounding ridges. They would fire sporadic, single shots that would thud into the adobe walls of her house or splinter the wood of her corral fence. The shots were not meant to kill her. They were meant to remind her that she was always in their sights, that she was never safe. At night, they would light massive bonfires on the hills, their whoops and drunken laughter carrying on the wind, a deliberate, taunting celebration of her impending doom. They would drag the carcasses of her slaughtered cattle into the fire, the sickening smell of burning hair and flesh a foul, inescapable reminder of her powerlessness. Isabella, or Ellie as she had been, was gone. In her place, La Sombra had been fully and irrevocably resurrected. She was not a frightened, cowering victim. She was a soldier, a general, planning the defense of her fortress of one. She spent her days working with a cold, focused efficiency. She barricaded the windows, leaving only small, narrow loopholes for firing. She reinforced the doors. She moved all her valuable late husband's papers, her own small keepsakes into the stone-walled root cellar, the safest place in the house. She rationed her food and her water with a miser's care, and she prepared her weapons. She had her own ivory-gripped Colt, and she had taken her husband's heavy Winchester rifle and his shotgun. She cleaned them, loaded them, and placed them at strategic positions throughout the house, turning her quiet, peaceful home into a veritable arsenal. But her greatest weapon was her mind. She knew she could not win a direct fight. She had to outthink them. She studied the terrain around her house, the placement of every rock, every dip in the land, every shadow. She planned her fields of fire, her escape routes, her last-ditch defensive positions. The isolation was a heavy, crushing weight. The silence of the house, once a comfort, was now a tense, listening thing. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle of the wind, was the sound of an approaching enemy. The loneliness was a physical ache, a constant companion in her long, sleepless nights. She found herself talking to the ghost of her husband, to the memory of her old crew, her words a low, desperate whisper in the darkness. The breaking point came on the 5th day. The water in the cistern was dangerously low. Her small herd of cattle, their tongues swollen, were bawling with a desperate, thirst-crazed thirst. She knew she had to do something. She had to make a move. She waited until just before dawn, the darkest, quietest part of the night. She took her husband's Winchester, a canteen of water, and slipped out the back of the house. Her plan was a desperate, almost suicidal one. She was going to try and break the dam. She moved with a silent, ghost-like grace that had not been dulled by 10 years of domesticity. She used the ravines and the shadows, a dark, fleeting shape in the pre-dawn gloom. She made it to within 100 yards of the spring, her heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. She could see the dam, and she could see the 2 men who were guarding it, 2 dark, silent figures huddled around a small, dying fire. She settled herself behind a rocky outcrop, the Winchester a cold, heavy weight in her hands. She was a magnificent shot. She had once, on a bet with Marcus, shot a silver dollar out of the air from 50 yards. But these were men. Living, breathing men. She had not killed a man in 10 years. She took a deep, steadying breath, the ghost of her past a cold, reassuring presence at her shoulder. She was not Ellie, the widow. She was La Sombra. She centered the rifle's sight on the chest of the first man, who was standing, stretching, his figure silhouetted against the first, pale light of the coming dawn. She squeezed the trigger. The roar of the Winchester was a defiant, declarative shout in the quiet morning. The man at the fire was thrown backward, a puppet whose strings had been cut. The second man, jolted from a light doze, scrambled for his rifle, his face a mask of shocked, uncomprehending surprise. Isabella worked the lever action of the Winchester, the spent cartridge flying, the new one sliding into place with a smooth, deadly click. She fired again. The second guard collapsed. She had done it. The old cold, killing instinct was still there. She had not hesitated. She had not flinched. But her victory was short-lived. Her shots, echoing through the hills, were a dinner bell, announcing her position to the rest of the Calder's men. She could hear the shouts from their main camp, the sound of horses being saddled. They would be on her in minutes. There was no time to break the dam. She had to run. She scrambled back the way she had come, her heart a cold, hard knot of failure and a new, terrible fear. She had revealed herself. She had left the safety of her fortress. And now, they were coming for her, a pack of wolves who had finally scented the blood of their cornered, and now very much alone, prey. While Isabella was making her desperate, fighting retreat back to her besieged ranch, the first of her ghosts was arriving. Elias, the scholar, had ridden for 2 days and 2 nights, pushing his horse to the brink of exhaustion, his mind a cold, logical machine, processing the scant information he had, formulating 100 different strategies and contingencies. He did not ride directly to Angel's Peak. That would be the move of a fool, an amateur. He approached the town from the south, through a series of dry, forgotten arroyos, his movements as silent and as subtle as a desert fox. He was a man who had made a living from understanding the hidden currents of a situation, and his first priority was to gather information. He left his horse in a hidden ravine and made the final approach to the town on foot, a nondescript, gray-haired man in a dusty traveler's coat. He entered the town not through its main street, but through the back alleys, moving with a ghost-like quiet. He found what he was looking for in the town's only saloon. It was the middle of the afternoon, and the place was mostly empty, save for a few hard-faced men who were drinking with a loud, proprietary arrogance. They were not locals. They had the hard, cruel look of hired guns. Calder's men. Elias took a seat at a quiet corner table, ordered a beer, and listened. He was a master of fading into the background, of becoming a piece of the furniture, a man so unassuming that he was utterly invisible. And he learned everything he needed to know. He learned about the Calder brothers, their brutal methods, their ambition to own the entire territory. He learned about the weak, ineffectual sheriff. And he learned about the stubborn widow on the Sparrowhawk Ranch, the one who was holding out, the one who had, according to the men's boasts, been put under siege. A cold, quiet, and utterly lethal fury began to build in his heart. They were talking about Isabella. His Isabella. His plan had been to find her, to assess the situation, to formulate a strategy. But the casual, arrogant cruelty of these men, the way they spoke of her as an object, a problem to be eliminated, had changed the timetable. The lesson would begin now. He waited until 2 of the men, their bellies full of beer and bravado, left the saloon, heading for the livery stable. He gave them a 2-minute head start, then followed, a silent, gray shadow in the afternoon sun. He found them in the dim, hay-scented quiet of the stable, saddling their horses, complaining about the boredom of this backwater town. Elias stepped out from behind a stack of hay bales, a long, Spanish fighting dagger in each hand. The light from the open stable door glinted on the razor-sharp steel. The 2 men spun around, their hands fumbling for their pistols. They were not fast. They were clumsy, beer-soaked thugs. Elias was a blur of motion. He was not a brawler. He was a fencer, a surgeon of violence. He moved with a dancer's grace, his blades a flickering, silver web. He did not kill them. That was not his purpose. His purpose was to send a message. He disarmed the first man with 2 lightning-fast cuts that severed the tendons in his gun hand, his pistol clattering uselessly to the floor. The man stared at his ruined hand, a scream of agony and disbelief tearing from his throat. The second man, his eyes wide with terror, managed to clear his pistol from its holster. But before he could aim, Elias's second blade had moved, piercing the man's thigh, the point of the knife pinning his leg to the wooden wall of the stable behind him. It was over in 5 seconds. 1 man was disarmed, the other was crucified. Elias knelt beside the man with the ruined hand. He leaned in, his voice a soft, chilling whisper. "You will tell your master, Mr. Calder," he said, "that the scholar sends his regards. And you will tell him that the first lesson is free. The next will be considerably more expensive." He then used the tip of his blade to carve a small, intricate, and unmistakable symbol into the man's cheek, the stylized shadow of a hawk, the mark of their old crew. He turned and walked away, leaving the 2 men, one screaming, one weeping, in the quiet of the stable. He had not come to Angel's Peak to save a town. He had come to answer a call from his family. He was the first of the ghosts to arrive, and he had just delivered the opening salvo in a war that was about to become far more personal, and far more bloody, than the Calder brothers could ever have imagined. Isabella ran. She ran with the desperate, lung-burning speed of a hunted animal, the sounds of the pursuit growing closer behind her. The horsemen were fanning out, their shouts echoing in the hills, a pack of hounds closing in on a fox. She had made a terrible, fatal mistake. She had left the safety of her den, and now she was caught in the open. She scrambled up a steep, rocky hillside, her hands and knees raw, her only thought to get to high ground, to find some small, defensible position. She found a shallow crevice, a small indentation in the rock face that offered a pathetic amount of cover. It would have to do. She lay flat, her chest heaving, her husband's Winchester pressed to her shoulder. She could see them now, 3 of them, dismounting at the base of the hill, beginning their slow, cautious ascent, their rifles held at the ready. This was it. The end. She could take one of them, maybe 2 if she was lucky, but they would get her. She thought of her husband, of her old crew, of the letters she had sent, a final, desperate prayer that would now go unanswered. A single hot, angry tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She was not afraid to die, but she was furious at the thought of dying alone, of her stand being a silent and witness final act of defiance. She took a deep, steadying breath. She centered the rifle's sight on the lead climber. She was La Sombra, and she would die on her feet. She was about to squeeze the trigger when a new sound, a sound so unexpected and so profound that it seemed to stop her very heart, echoed through the canyon. It was the deep, deafening, thunderous boom of a .50 caliber Sharps rifle, fired from a great distance. The man she had been aiming at, the lead climber, did not cry out. He simply ceased to exist, his body thrown backward by the sheer, kinetic force of the massive slug, a broken, lifeless puppet tumbling back down the hillside. The other 2 men froze, their faces a mask of stunned, uncomprehending terror. They stared at the body of their companion, then frantically scanned the high, distant ridges, searching for the source of the impossible shot. Another boom, and the second man, who was trying to scramble for the cover of a boulder, was slammed against the rock face, his rifle flying from his hands. The third man, his nerve completely shattered, threw down his own rifle and began a wild, panicked scramble back down the hill, his only thought to escape this place of sudden, invisible death. Isabella lay in her crevice, her mind reeling. She knew that sound. She had heard it 100 times before, in the heat of 100 desperate battles. There was only one man in the world who could shoot like that. She scrambled to the edge of her hiding place and looked up, her eyes scanning the highest, most distant ridge, a place a mile away, a place that seemed to touch the very sky. And she saw him, a tiny, solitary figure, silhouetted against the bright, blue canvas of the sky. A man with a long rifle. Gideon, she whispered, the name a prayer, an exhalation of hope so profound it was almost painful. The ghost had arrived. Gideon, from his sniper's perch a mile away, had been watching the scene unfold with a cold, detached precision. He had arrived in the territory the day before and, like Elias, had begun a slow, patient reconnaissance. From the high country, he had seen it all: the besieged ranch, the circling riders, and finally, Isabella's desperate, solo raid on the dam. He had followed her, a silent, unseen guardian angel, his long rifle his instrument of salvation. He had let the situation play out, his hunter's patience a thing of legend, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal his presence. He watched now as the third, surviving thug reached the bottom of the hill, scrambled onto his horse, and galloped away, a terrified messenger of the new, terrible reality of the battle. He then turned his attention to Isabella. She was looking up, towards him, and even from this impossible distance, he could feel her gaze. He raised a hand, a single, slow, deliberate gesture. I am here. You are not alone. He then packed his rifle and his spyglass and began the long, patient work of disappearing. He was the ghost. His work was not done in the open. His work was done from the shadows, from the places no one ever thought to look. He had announced his arrival. He had evened the odds. And now, he would begin to haunt the Calder brothers in a way that would make their worst nightmares seem like a pleasant dream. Isabella made her way back to her ranch, her heart a tumultuous mixture of relief all, and a new, fierce, and burning hope. The siege was not over, but she was no longer a solitary, cornered widow. The shadows were gathering, and the ghosts of her past had just begun to fight. The arrival of the scholar and the ghost had transformed the siege of the Sparrowhawk Ranch. It was no longer a simple matter of a dozen thugs terrorizing a lone woman. It was now a complex, multi-front war, a lethal chess game being played out across the rugged landscape of the territory. The Calder brothers, headquartered in the now fortified town of Angel's Peak, were reeling. Their leader, a brutish, pragmatic man named Caleb Calder, had received the two messages. The first was delivered by the two men from the saloon, one with a branded cheek and a ruined hand, the other with a knife still pinning his leg to the wall of the stable where he had been left. The second message was delivered by the terrified, babbling survivor of Gideon's long-range justice. The messages were clear. They were not dealing with a simple widow. They were dealing with a team of professional, highly skilled, and utterly ruthless killers. The siege of the ranch was now a stalemate. Calder's men, terrified of the ghosts that haunted the hills, refused to get close. Isabella, now in communication with her two old partners through a series of coded signals, a blanket hung in a window, a lantern lit at a certain time, was content to stay in her fortress. Her confidence bolstered by the knowledge that she was no longer alone. The war shifted to the town of Angels Peak itself. Elias, disguised as a mild-mannered, itinerant bookkeeper, had taken a room at the town's only hotel. He was a whisper in the Calder's ear, a phantom who moved through their own stronghold, gathering information, sowing discord. He learned the names of their suppliers, the schedules of their patrols, the weaknesses and vices of their key men. Gideon, from his hidden perches in the high country that surrounded the town, was the ever-present and seen threat. He didn't kill. He dismantled. He would shoot the whiskey bottle out of a man's hand from 1,000 yards. He would cripple their lead supply wagon by shooting out its axle. He would send a single, terrifying bullet into the Calder's own headquarters in the middle of the night, a bullet that would shatter the mirror behind Caleb Calder's head, a clear, unmistakable message: I can reach you anytime, anywhere. The Calder's men, already a superstitious, brutish lot, were beginning to crack. They were fighting shadows, ghosts, a legend. Their morale was crumbling. It was into this tense, simmering cauldron that the third, and most unexpected, of the ghosts arrived. Father Michael, the man who had once been Marcus, the preacher, arrived in Angel's Peak not on a fiery steed, but on a tired, dusty mule. He was a simple priest, his black cassock covered in the dust of a long, hard journey, a simple wooden crucifix around his neck. He came with a story. He was a missionary. He told the suspicious townsfolk, sent to bring a church to this lost, godless corner of the territory. He was charismatic, his voice a rich, soothing baritone, his eyes holding a deep, compassionate light. The townspeople, their own faith worn thin by the Calder's oppressive presence, were wary at first. But his gentle persistence, his genuine kindness, began to win them over. Caleb Calder and his brothers saw him as a joke, a harmless, Bible-thumping fool. They let him set up a makeshift chapel in an abandoned, collapsing adobe building, a place they mockingly called the preacher's pen. But Marcus was not just a priest. He was the preacher. And his true sermon was not one of peace, but of rebellion. He began to work on the souls of the townspeople. He did not preach fire and brimstone. He spoke of courage. He spoke of the story of David and Goliath. He spoke of the moral obligation of good people to stand against the tyranny of evil men. He was a master of words, of persuasion, of finding the flicker of courage in a man's heart and fanning it into a flame. And he began to work on the souls of the Calder's own men. The saloon was his new confessional. He would sit with the thugs, not as a priest, but as a man who understood the hard choices and the moral compromises of the frontier. He would play cards with them, his old, forgotten skills with a deck returning as if by magic. He would win their money, but more importantly, he would win their confidence. He would listen to their stories, their grievances, their fears. He found the cracks in their loyalty, the men who were only there for the money, the ones who were beginning to doubt the sanity of a war against ghosts. He was the serpent in their Eden, a whisper of doubt, a promise of a different path. His most important work, however, was with Isabella. He sent a secret message to her, a coded note passed through the same stable boy who had delivered her original letters. He arranged a meeting, a clandestine rendezvous in the town's small, moonlit cemetery. When Isabella saw him, her heart stopped. She saw the priest-scholar, but she saw the man beneath it. The same handsome, devil-may-care smile. The same intelligent, laughing eyes. "Marcus," she whispered, the name a ghost on her own lips. "I thought you were dead." "Reports of my demise," he said, his smile widening, "have been greatly exaggerated." Their reunion was a thing of deep, profound, and complicated emotions. They were ghosts of a life that was long gone, to people who had once been everything to each other. "I came as soon as I got your letter," he said, his voice serious now. "I am not the man I was, Isabella, but I could not leave you to face this alone." He told her his plan. It was not a plan of knives and guns. It was a preacher's plan. A plan of words, of faith, and of turning the enemy's own weakness against them. "The Calder brothers rule through fear," he explained. "We will fight them with hope. We will give the people of this town, and the men in their own crew, a different choice." The foreshadows were now all in place. The scholar, the ghost, the preacher, and La Sombra herself. The siege of the ranch was about to be broken. The war for the soul of Angel's Peak was about to begin. The final act of the war for Angel's Peak began not with a gunshot, but with a sermon. It was a Sunday morning, and the sun beat down on the dusty, tense town with a merciless intensity. Marcus, or Father Michael as the town knew him, stood before his small, makeshift chapel. But he was not just addressing the dozen or so nervous townspeople who had gathered. He had sent a message to the Calder brothers, a challenge of a kind they had never seen before. He had invited them, and their men, to come and hear his sermon. He had promised them that it would be enlightening. Caleb Calder, his arrogance mixed with a growing, superstitious curiosity about the charismatic priest who seemed to have a strange hold on the town, had accepted. It was a diversion, a way to break the monotony of the tense stalemate. He and his two brothers, along with their entire, dwindling force of about 15 men, swaggered into the town square, their pistols on their hips, their faces a mask of cynical amusement. They were coming to watch a show. Marcus stood on a small, wooden platform, the brilliant, hard sunlight making his simple, black cassock seem all the more dramatic. He did not open a Bible. He did not speak of Scripture. He looked out at the faces before him, frightened townspeople on one side, the arrogant, brutish outlaws on the other, and he began to speak. "I see before me two armies," he began, his voice a rich, powerful baritone that seemed to command the very air. "One army fights for their homes, for their families, for a piece of this hard land that they have earned with their own sweat and their own tears. The other fights for a man's greed, for a few clinking silver dollars that will be spent on cheap whiskey and cheaper women before the week is out." He looked directly at the Calder's men. "I have spoken to many of you. I know your stories. You are not evil men. You are hard men, who have made hard choices in a hard world. You follow a strong leader. But is he leading you to prosperity? Or is he leading you to a grave?" He then began his true sermon. It was a sermon of information, a sermon of truth. It was a performance that was the culmination of weeks of his and Elias's patient, intelligence-gathering work. He began to speak of the Calder's men, one by one. He spoke of a man named Lefty, and how his share of their last robbery had been lost in a rigged poker game run by Caleb Calder himself. He spoke of a young man named Billy, and the letters he had been receiving from his sick mother, letters that Caleb Calder had been intercepting and burning. He spoke of deals that had been broken, of promises that had been betrayed, of loyal men who had been used and discarded by their leaders. He was not just speaking, he was vivisecting their entire organization, laying its rotten, corrupt heart bare for all to see. The faces of the outlaws began to change, their cynical amusement replaced by dawning expressions of shock, of anger, of betrayal. They began to look at each other, then at their leaders, with a new, dawning suspicion. Elias, the scholar, was not idle. While Marcus held the crowd's attention, he was moving through the back alleys of the town, a silent, gray specter. He had another part to play in this sermon. He had a list of the 5 men Marcus had identified as being the most wavering, the most likely to turn. He began to approach their horses, which were tethered in a long line at the edge of the square. High on the ridge overlooking the town, Gideon, the ghost, was also a part of the performance. His role was to provide the sermon's final, punctuating miracle. Back in the square, Marcus reached the crescendo of his speech. "The Calder brothers have offered you a wage of blood and betrayal," he boomed, his voice ringing with a righteous fury. "I am here to offer you something else. I am here to offer you a choice." It was then that Elias made his move. He used his knives not to kill, but to cut. In a swift, silent series of movements, he sliced through the cinches of the saddles on the horses of the 5 men he had targeted. And it was then that Gideon fired his sharps. The bullet, fired from an impossible distance, did not strike a man. It struck the iron cross on the top of the makeshift chapel, a perfect, impossible, and seemingly miraculous shot. The cross let out a loud, ringing gong that seemed to be a sign from heaven itself. In the stunned silence that followed, Marcus made his final, dramatic gesture. He pointed a long, accusatory finger at Caleb Calder. "This man is a liar, a thief, and a false prophet, and his power over you is an illusion." The 5 men whose saddles had been cut, their superstitious fears now ignited by the miracle of the ringing cross, and their anger stoked by Marcus's revelations, made their choice. They broke from the ranks of the outlaws, their faces a mixture of fear and a new, defiant resolve. Caleb Calder, his face a mask of apoplectic rage, drew his pistol. "Traitors!" he screamed. "You're all dead." But before he could fire, another figure stepped out from the shadows of the blacksmith's forge. It was Isabella. La Sombra. She was not dressed as a widow. She was dressed in the practical, dark clothes of a gunfighter, her ivory-gripped Colt held steady in her hand. "No, Caleb," she said, her voice as cold and as final as a gravestone. "You are." The sermon was over. The rebellion had begun. The war for the soul of Angel's Peak was about to reach its final, bloody conclusion in the middle of the town square. The town square of Angel's Peak, a moment before a place of tense, verbal confrontation, exploded into a whirlwind of chaotic, desperate violence. The 5 outlaws who had defected from the Calders, seeing their former leader's murderous intent, drew their own guns, their fear replaced by the desperate courage of men with nothing left to lose. The battle was not a clean, organized gunfight. It was a messy, swirling melee, a war fought on a dozen different fronts at once. The townspeople, who had been huddled in fear, now reacted with a surprising, unified fury. The blacksmith and a half-dozen other men, who had been secretly armed by Marcus, opened fire from the doorways and windows of the surrounding buildings, their shots adding to the chaos. Isabella, La Sombra, was a figure of calm, lethal grace in the heart of the storm. She did not fire wildly. She moved with a dancer's precision, her Colt barking in a steady, measured rhythm. Her targets were not the common thugs, but the leaders. Her first shot took the youngest Calder brother, Zeke, in the shoulder, spinning him around and taking him out of the fight. Marcus, the preacher, was a revelation. He threw off his priest's cassock, revealing the practical, dark clothes of a gunfighter beneath. The silver-plated derringer seemed to leap into his hand as if by magic. He was not a frontline brawler, he was a master of angles and opportunities. He moved through the chaos, a charming, deadly phantom, his small, 2-shot weapon a surprisingly effective tool of disruption. He shot the gun out of one man's hand, and put a bullet in the leg of another who was trying to flank the defectors. Elias, the scholar, had also joined the fray, his Spanish daggers a blur of silver in the sunlight. He was not a gunfighter. He was a close-quarters artist of death. He moved through the swirling gunsmoke like a ghost, his blades silent, precise, and utterly final. He dispatched 2 of the most loyal Calder thugs before they even knew he was there. From the high ridge, Gideon, the ghost, was the battle's unseen, all-powerful god. His Sharps rifle was no longer a tool of intimidation, it was an instrument of final judgment. He did not fire into the chaos of the main melee. He focused on the edges of the fight, on the men who tried to escape, the ones who tried to find a defensible position. His rifle boomed, and one by one, the Calder's forces were whittled down, their numbers dwindling under the relentless, accurate fire from the heavens. Caleb Calder, his army disintegrating around him, his brothers wounded and useless, was a cornered, raging bull. He saw his empire, his power, his very life, turning to dust before his eyes. His rage focused on a single target, the woman who had started it all. He saw Isabella, who was reloading her Colt behind the cover of a water trough, and he charged, his own pistol roaring. Bullets tore through the wooden side of the trough, sending splinters flying, forcing Isabella to keep her head down. Caleb was closing the distance, his face a mask of insane, suicidal fury. It was Marcus who saw the danger. He saw Caleb charging, his attention completely focused on Isabella. He saw his chance. He had been a priest. He had taken vows. But in that moment, he was the preacher, and his family was in danger. He stepped out from behind the cover of the saloon porch, directly into Caleb's path. "Looking for me, friend?" he called out, his voice a charming, devil-may-care taunt. Caleb spun, his rage now directed at this new, unexpected threat. He fired, his shot going wide in his fury. Marcus did not fire back. He smiled, a sad, fatalistic smile. He had made his choice. He was a distraction, a sacrifice. And as Caleb's attention was focused on Marcus, Isabella rose from behind the water trough, her Colt now reloaded, its aim steady, its purpose absolute. She fired once. A single clean and perfect shot. Caleb called her. The tyrant of Angel's Peak stood frozen for a single, stunned heartbeat, a look of profound, final surprise on his face, a small, dark hole appearing in the center of his chest. Then he crumpled to the ground, his reign of terror over. A stunned, ringing silence fell over the town square, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the distant, lonely cry of a hawk. The battle was over. The shadows, the four ghosts from a life that was supposed to be dead and buried, had won. The dust of the battle settled, leaving behind the grim, quiet arithmetic of the aftermath. The Calder gang was shattered, its leaders dead or wounded, its surviving members surrendering to the now emboldened townspeople. The square was a scene of carnage, but it was also a place of a hard-won, bloody liberation. The four shadows stood together in the center of it all, a silent, somber island in a sea of wreckage. The adrenaline of the fight was gone, leaving behind the heavy, weary weight of what they had done. They were killers. They had tried to be other people, a scholar, a hermit, a priest, a widow. But the battle had stripped those facades away, leaving them with the cold, hard truth of who they were. Their reunion was not a joyous one. It was a thing of deep, profound, and unspoken emotions. Elias cleaned his blades with a methodical, detached calm. Gideon ejected the last spent shell from his rifle, his face a pale, haunted mask. Isabella reloaded her Colt, her hands steady, but her eyes filled with a deep, aching sadness. It was Marcus who broke the silence. He had a long, shallow gash on his arm, a souvenir of a close call, but his smile, when he looked at Isabella, was genuine. Just like old times, somber, he said, his voice a little too light, a little too forced. No, Marcus, she replied, her voice a low, weary whisper. Nothing like old times. In the old days, it had been a job. This had been personal. They had a reckoning of their own to face, a reckoning with the ghosts of their own pasts. They gathered that evening in Isabella's ranch house, the place where the new war had begun. The shattered door had been removed, leaving the house open to the cool night air. They sat in the parlor, the four of them, for the first time in 10 years. They were older, scarred, changed by the separate, lonely paths they had walked. What now? Gideon asked, his voice a rough and used sound. Do we go back? Back to being them? He gestured vaguely, a gesture that encompassed a mountain cabin, a gentleman's club, a dusty mission. There is no going back, Elias said, his voice a quiet, final statement. We have been seen. The legend is awake again. The world will not let us be those people anymore. He was right. The story of the Battle of Angel's Peak would spread like a prairie fire. The story of the ghosts who had come back to save a town. They would be hunted, by the law, by other outlaws, by men seeking to make a name for themselves by challenging the legend. I cannot go back to being a priest, Marcus said, his voice filled with a profound, aching grief. He looked at his hands, at the hands that had held a gun instead of a crucifix. I have broken my vows. I have taken a life. I have no place in God's house anymore. A deep, heavy silence fell over the room. They were adrift, a family of ghosts in a world that had no place for them. It was Isabella, La Sombra, their leader, who finally showed them the way. She stood and looked at the three men who were her family, her only family. We have spent 10 years running from who we are, she said, her voice a low, steady flame in the darkness. We have tried to be other people, and the world would not let us. Because this is who we are. We are not just killers. We are protectors. We are the justice that comes in the night, for people who have no other justice to turn to. She looked at each of them in turn, her stormy eyes holding a new, powerful conviction. So, we will not run anymore. We will not hide. We will be who we were meant to be. We will be the Cuatro Sombras again. Not for money. Not for a government. But for ourselves. For people like the folks in this town. We will be a shadow that falls on the wicked. We will be a ghost that haunts the unjust. That will be our penance. And that will be our redemption. Her words were a new sermon, a new creed. She was offering them not a return to the past, but a new future, a future that embraced their dark skills but gave them a noble purpose. Elias, the scholar, looked at her, and the cold, detached mask of the assassin was replaced by a look of profound, intellectual respect. Gideon, the ghost, looked at her, and the haunted artist saw a new, terrible, and magnificent beauty to be captured. And Marcus, the preacher, looked at her, and the fallen priest saw a new, different kind of faith to believe in, a faith in the family that had just saved his soul. The reckoning of the ghosts was over. A new covenant had been made. The foreshadows would ride again. The town of Angel's Peak was reborn. The Calders were gone, their reign of terror a fading memory. The townspeople, their courage and unity forged in the crucible of the battle, began to build a new future for themselves, a future based on the quiet, hard-won strength they had discovered within themselves. And they had new and seen guardians. The foreshadows did not stay in Angel's Peak. That was not their way. They were ghosts, and ghosts need the freedom of the open, lonely spaces. They re-established their base of operations at Isabella's ranch, the Sparrowhawk, a name they reclaimed from their own shared history. The ranch was no longer just a home. It was a sanctuary, a fortress, the quiet, secret heart of their new order. They became a legend, a whisper on the wind. Stories began to be told in the far-flung, forgotten corners of the territory. Stories of a mysterious, scholarly man who would appear in a corrupt town, and suddenly, its crooked political machine would collapse from within. Stories of a phantom sniper on a high ridge, whose single, impossible shot would save a family of homesteaders from a band of marauders. Stories of a charismatic, priest-like figure who would ride into a mining camp on the verge of a bloody labor war and, with the power of his words and the turn of a card, would avert the disaster, leaving the camp's oppressors mysteriously broken. And stories of a woman, a beautiful, dark-haired wraith, La Sombra, who would lead them all, a figure of swift, final, and utterly righteous justice, who would appear with her crew where the law was weak and the wicked were strong, and would restore a desperate, bloody balance. They took no money. They sought no fame. Their payment was a kind of penance, or rebalancing of their own, blood-stained karmic scales. They were atoning for the sins of their past by becoming the instruments of a new, harder, and more personal kind of justice. One evening, a year after the Battle of Angel's Peak, the four of them sat on the porch of Isabella's ranch house. A comfortable, easy silence settled over them. They were a family, whole again, their broken pieces reforged into something new, something stronger. Elias was cleaning his knives, his movements a familiar, meditative ritual. Gideon was sketching the sunset, his charcoal capturing the fleeting, savage beauty of the sky. Marcus was shuffling a deck of cards, his hands a blur of practiced, elegant motion. And Isabella was cleaning her ivory grip cold, its steel gleaming in the last, golden light of the day. "Do you ever miss it?" Marcus asked, his voice a soft, thoughtful murmur in the quiet. The quiet life. Isabella looked at the faces of her family, her three ghosts, her three brothers. She looked at the vast, beautiful, and dangerous land that was their home, their territory, their responsibility. "No, Marcus," she said, a slow, contented smile touching her lips. "This is the quiet life. It's just our version of it." The foreshadows sat together as the night fell, for legends who had found their peace not by running from the darkness, but by becoming it. They were a family, a creed, a promise. And in the vast, lawless heart of the Old West, the wicked had a new reason to fear the coming of the night, and the righteous had a new, desperate reason to hope for the coming of the shadows.